The Athletic.
Hello and welcome back to And Colossally That's History. I'm Richard Williams, and as ever, I'm joined by my friend and co-host Matt Bishop on our mission to reappraise motor racing history.
Yes, and what a topic we're tackling today, Richard. This is history with a capital H.
Yep. Many history podcasts have charted the rise, and indeed the fall, of Nazism in Germany in the first half of the 20th century. But in this episode, we're going to be looking at how sport, and particularly motorsport, was used as a tool, or you might say weapon, of the Nazi state.
And this is a topic that you're very well versed in, Richard, because you've written a book about Richard Seaman, A Race with Love and Death, I believe it's called. Richard Seaman, obviously the famous British pre-war Grand Prix driver who drove for Mercedes-Benz in the late 30s.
Yeah, Richard Seaman was somebody I grew up reading about when I was a kid because he'd been an inspiration to Stirling Moss and Peter Collins and Mike Hawthorne, that generation of post-war British drivers. And I was always very interested in his story, this young guy who made his way through motor racing and eventually got to drive for Mercedes-Benz and then was killed in 1939, just a few weeks before the start of the war, while he was leading the Belgian Grand Prix, in fact. So I did a lot of research, and of course a lot of it took me into the 1930s and the politics of the time, because if you were an Englishman and you wanted to, or you were invited to drive for Mercedes, you had to be signed off by Adolf Hitler, get his approval.
I mean, it's hard to think about that now, really, isn't it? How, a patriotic Englishman, Richard Seaman, could have raced with in a Mercedes with a swastika on the side of his car, and would raise his hand in a Nazi salute when he won a race. That's hard to think of so many years later, but it happened, didn't it?
Yes, it did happen, and it happened because the Mercedes team and the Auto Union team, the two big German Grand Prix teams, were bankrolled by Hitler's National Socialist government, and they were a kind of weapon of the state in that sense. So,
yes, I think we should then... I mean, Richard Seaman is a fascinating subject, and we should probably do a podcast on him another time. But we should start, really, with talking about how Nazism and motorsport, how they should ever have become intertwined in the first place. And I guess the answer to that lies with Hitler himself, Adolf Hitler himself, because he was a huge car enthusiast, wasn't he, Richard? I mean, it's reported that he even had a picture of Henry Ford on the wall of his office at the Nazi party headquarters in Munich.
Yeah. Well, Hitler was a car fan. He had his first Mercedes in 1923. And 10 years later, when he was elected, just very shortly after being elected at the Berlin Motor Show, he made a grand announcement of his motorization project, which fell into three parts. One was the construction of the Autobahns, Europe's first motorway network, which would speed German civilians around the country, but would also be rather useful for getting your army from one side of the country to the other if you so needed. The second was the creation of the people's car, which became the Volkswagen. And the third was the motorsport effort in Grand Prix racing, which was the thing that would really wave the flag for the supremacy of German engineering.
And we'll talk about precisely that over the next hour. But I think I'll just say a little bit about the Volkswagen, literally the people's car in German, launched in the mid-30s. The first people's car of its kind. Well, you could say the Ford Model T as well, but bringing automotive transport to the masses in that sense. And, of course, a hugely successful car that became the best-selling car of all time globally and was still being made, I think, 60 years later in South America, Mexico and Brazil. And obviously Volkswagen now, the Volkswagen Audi Group, one of the largest multinational corporations in the world. But it all came from Hitler's whim, really, to have a people's car. And it was designed by Ferdinand Porsche, actually, wasn't it?
Yes, it was, who'd designed a lot of interesting things by that point, including the big Mercedes sports cars of the late 20s, the SSKs, which were the supercars of their time, and Porsche was behind those. And then he went on to design the first Auto Union in 1934-35, their first Grand Prix car. So he was a very significant figure in all this at the time.
I mean, we have to suspend our obvious distaste for Nazism, and that goes for everything we're going to say going forward.
We can't suspend it.
No, we can't suspend it. We have to state it categorically. Yeah. Yes, I'm properly admonished there, Richard. But you know what I meant. We don't suspend it. We categorically state it. Obviously. Nonetheless, those cars, those 30s Mercs, utterly beautiful machines and incredibly highly engineered. I mean, Bernie Ecclestone used to buy them whenever he could, I think.
I believe he did. Yes, and it's very interesting to reflect on the way that the German car industry came from nothing, really, in a way, after the war. Germany had suffered from the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, which, in which Britain and France said that they couldn't have an army or an air force anymore, and they had to make all kinds of reparations. But they did have a bit of a recovery during the 20s. But then, of course, there was the great Wall Street crash and the worldwide financial depression, which hit Germany very hard because it wasn't really in that strong a position at the time. So Mercedes, for instance, which had been busy in the First World War making all kinds of things like fuselages for German fighter planes, after the war they concentrated on cars and trucks, built their staff up to 15,000 people. They had 15,000 workers in the factory just outside Stuttgart. But then when the crash came, that went down to 5,000, and the production of vehicles went right down. And not until 1933, when Hitler and the National Socialists came in, did it pick up, partly through government encouragement and subsidy, of course.
Yeah, I mean, people might not all know the state Germany was in between the wars in that sense, partly, as you say, as a result of being punished by the Allies after the First World War. I mean, my grandmother, Barbara Wall, as a journalist, and Barbara Lucas as a novelist, was a rare thing for a woman at the time. She wrote for The Observer and The Spectator in the 30s, and she went to Italy and Germany. And I remember her telling me, she's dead of course now, I remember her telling me that the inflation was so galloping in Germany at the time. I don't know if it's an apocryphal story, but I'm not going to accuse my late grandmother of telling a porky, so let's hope it isn't. But she said that people would take wheelbarrows full of money to buy their shopping, and they'd find that the wheelbarrow was stolen and the money left. That's the nature of the inflation. So really, it was an extraordinary thing. Now, returning to or moving away from that background around the really difficult situation in Germany, which of course led to Hitler in some ways, bringing Hitler into it. But also there's a story, isn't there, about Caracciola. So Rudolf Caracciola, who was one of the great drivers of Silver Arrows, didn't he have a car delivered? Or did he have to deliver a car? Tell us the story. Well,
Caracciola came up in the 20s, and it was clear that he was the new German ace. And he drove for Mercedes in the 20s, the cars that Ferdinand Porsche had designed. And they managed to revive the fortunes that had been left in abeyance in 1914, when actually they'd won the French Grand Prix, the last Grand Prix before the First World War. So Caracciola was pretty instrumental in their renaissance in the 20s. And actually, he did so well that he set himself up as a Mercedes dealer on the Kurfürstendamm in Berlin, which is the kind of Regent Street of Berlin, the big posh shopping street. But then when the crash came, actually he sold his dealership, but he was still very well in with Mercedes on that side. And in 1931, before Hitler came to power, he'd ordered from his friend, who was the Mercedes dealer in Munich, he'd ordered a special limousine, custom built, 7.7-litre, black convertible, bulletproof windows, and a glove compartment fitted with a hidden pocket for a revolver. Perhaps to shoot himself eventually, who knows. Anyway, this car was... it took a long time to build, not surprisingly, and I think Hitler was getting a bit impatient. But so when they finished it, they sweetened the experience by getting Caracciola to deliver it to him, so which would be, I don't know, one doesn't like to draw comparisons nowadays, but if you can imagine Lewis Hamilton delivering a car to the Prime Minister, or indeed to the King, that would be roughly equivalent, I suppose. And Hitler's relationship with Mercedes had always been good. They had, in fact, supported his political party, the National Socialists, before they came to power, through Wilhelm Kissel, who was the president of the board or chairman of the board of Mercedes, and a banker called Straub, I think, who was the head of the Deutsche Bank and also the president of the Mercedes trustees. So they were pretty well in with this government that was going to come in. And one of the first things that happened after Hitler had announced his motorization project was that Kissel asked on behalf of Mercedes for 1 million Reichsmarks in order to fund the Grand Prix project.
Fascinating. So Caracciola had been asked to run that rather onerous errand for Hitler, but he was never a member of the Nazi Party himself, I don't think.
No, he wasn't. All the German drivers who raced for Mercedes were members of the NSKK, which was the sort of German equivalent of the RAC, to which all racing drivers had to belong. Of the three big German drivers with Mercedes in the 30s, only Hermann Lang was a member of the Nazi Party, and that was because he'd come up as a mechanic, and he felt that really it was probably
I think von Brauchitsch perhaps was as well.
No, he wasn't actually. Strangely, even though his uncle was the commander of the armed forces.
Yes.
And he was, a sort of Prussian officer in all but name, but he wasn't actually a member of the party, and neither was Caracciola.
So the result of all this, Hitler's enthusiasm, was that two companies, Mercedes-Benz and Auto Union, embraced this race for speed, creating these extraordinary cars, very, very powerful cars. We're talking about 90 years ago, and they had 500 horsepower, V12s, V8s, V16s in some cases. Extraordinary cars, brilliant drivers, and totally outclassed the Italians, the Alfas and Maseratis of the time. But of course, then came the Second World War, and I'm just jumping forward and we'll jump back, but it's an interesting detail, because the Alfettas had been outclassed in the 30s by the Auto Unions and Mercedes. But after the Second World War, of course, when Formula One was inaugurated in 1950, or when the Formula One World Championship was inaugurated in 1950, the Alfettas reigned supreme because the Mercs and Auto Unions weren't allowed to compete or didn't feel able to compete. That's true, isn't it, really?
Yes, it is. Yeah, the Alfettas had been put away for the war and brought out, and there were no Mercedes around. Auto Union weren't making... Auto Union didn't exist anymore at that point. The Alfettas and the Ferraris and the Maseratis ruled the roost until 1955, when the Silver Arrows came back in the shape of Mercedes. And that was a little bit like, in the 20s, it was all about Bugattis and Delages and Maseratis and Alfas, and the early 30s too. But then when the two German teams were unveiled in 1934 and then began to race seriously in 1935, everything changed completely. And really from 1935 to the outbreak of the Second World War, Only one Grand Prix was won by a non-German team. That was Nuvolari in an Alfa at the Nurburgring in 1935 with a very famous display of virtuosity. But every other race was won by either Mercedes or Auto Union. And Wilhelm Kissel hadn't got his million Reichsmarks, but Hitler did give Mercedes 500,000 Reichsmarks and 300,000 to Auto Union, which was a sort of merged project of four manufacturers, Audi, Horch, Wanderer and DKW, who were all road car manufacturers, and they got together and created this team in a town called Zwickau in northern Germany. And that's where the Auto Unions came from, and Porsche designed those, as we've said before. And those two went head-to-head. And it's quite interesting that the Audi broke cover first with their amazing rear-engined V16 car, which was silver. And they broke some records at Avus, the high-speed track in Berlin. And then Mercedes launched their car, which was initially painted white, which was the traditional German racing colour. All Mercedes races had been white before that, and the other German teams. But this was a weight limit formula, 750 kilograms. So every ounce counted. And the next time the Mercedes were seen, they'd had their white paint stripped off to save weight, and they were silver like the Auto Unions. And a German radio reporter immediately christened them the Silberpfeilen, the silver arrows, and that's the nickname that we still have today, of course.
Actually, a similar situation pertains today, where we see unpainted carbon fibre on modern Formula One cars.
We do. Everything in pursuit of that ounce.
Every ounce.
Yeah.
You mentioned Nuvolari's great victory at Nurburgring in 1935, and it's worth just dwelling on that because, I mean, Nuvolari was 42. He wasn't a young man. I think his Alfa was had about 265 horsepower, and I think the Silver Arrows had maybe about 120. Well, some of them had up to about 380 horsepower, so significantly more. Von Brauchitsch was leading, wasn't he? And Hitler was present, and 300,000 local fans had come to see Germany triumph. And as they set off on the last lap, Nuvolari started pushing. And von Brauchitsch, who was a good driver but not a great driver, of course Nuvolari was one of the greatest drivers of all time, Nuvolari started pushing him, and von Brauchitsch began to push hard and wore his tyres out, basically. As a result of which Nuvolari came round and won, to, first of all, some disappointment and silence. But then I gather that the 300,000 fans saw genius at work and clapped. Hitler did not clap, I gather.
Well, they'd been ready to play the German national anthem over the tannoy, of course, and what they had a 78 RPM record of it to play, with the gramophone. So then they couldn't play that, so they had to scratch around. And I believe Nuvolari had brought a record of the Italian anthem with him, and they had to get that and play that instead.
Apparently, he always carried it for luck. So there we are.
Well, the shock of Nuvolari's victory in 1935 was all the greater because Mercedes and Auto Union had become their teams were such machines by that point, particularly Mercedes. When I was doing my research on Richard Seaman, I discovered that the Mercedes racing team alone had 380 people working on it.
Wow!
Just building their 3 or 4 Grand Prix cars every year, and of course they had Alfred Neubauer, the great team manager, and Rudolf Uhlenhaut, great engineer, and lots of other designers and so on. So it was a pretty massive operation.
Massive operation. And in some ways, this may be a stretch, but in some ways I've often thought there's a similarity. The race for speed between Mercedes and Auto Union was a little bit like the race for space between the United States and the USSR in the 60s. So 30 years later. And it reminds me, strangely, the things and the places you end up doing and going to as a journalist. I remember in the late 1990s being invited, funnily enough, appropriately enough, by Mercedes, who were then the engine supplier of the McLaren Formula One team. I was a journalist at the time. I wasn't yet working for McLaren. And I was invited to Star City in Moscow, which I believe is called apologies to Russian speakers, something like Zvyodsky Gorodok, I believe, which means Star City, or is transliterated anyway as Star City, or translated as Star City. And I went with Merck and David Coulthard, and we viewed the old installation where the cosmonauts and the spacecraft had been built and launched from. My goodness, absolutely fascinating, but so primitive. You know, you'd walk around and you'd see this is a spacecraft, this is a space capsule, and you can't believe. You wouldn't want to fly, you know, from here to Newcastle in it. We're speaking in London, by the way. You wouldn't want to fly that far. They flew to space in it. And the cockpits of these things, I mean, they brought to mind a Hawker Hurricane, you know, a 1930s British fighter plane. So antiquated, scarily antiquated. And, of course, very dangerous. And speed races and space races are both dangerous, especially back in the day, and especially when the motivation is national pride.
And that feels like a good time to take our first break. Join us in a moment for part 2.
So, in part 1, we discussed Hitler's obsession with cars and his desire to develop Germany's automotive industry and dominate international motorsport. So now would probably be a good time to discuss motor racing in the first part of the 20th century, before Hitler's rise to power, because it wasn't German cars or drivers who were dominant at that time, was it, Richard?
No, although they'd had a good period before the First World War, immediately before, when Mercedes and Opel were racing against Fiat and Delage and various other manufacturers. But then came the First World War, and that was the end of that for a bit. So the 20s really was dominated by Bugatti, Alfa Romeo, Delage particularly, and then Maserati came along too, and that rolled into the 30s. And of course, Grand Prix races they were a development of the great city-to-city or town-to-town races with which road racing had started, often on giant triangular courses, might be 60 or 70 miles. Well, that scaled down quite a lot, particularly when circuits like Spa were devised, which was still on public roads, but very much shorter. But the races were long. The races were several hours long, often 6 or 7 hours long, and very grueling.
Riding mechanics.
With riding mechanics, indeed, who were sometimes quite necessary. It wasn't a job you'd necessarily volunteer for, though, I wouldn't have thought. Quite dangerous, not to have any control. Anyway, yeah, that was all part of it. And then it began to get more, well, it was already getting more professional in the late 20s. And when the Germans came along, it became the sport we know now, with teams absolutely dedicated to technological evolution and to taking everything as far as it can possibly go. And that's what the Germans did.
So I think that's true. I think it was the first professional approach to international motorsport. And the team ethos was there. And as you say, hundreds of employees. But also technical tour de force, but also presentational. It's very important in all sport, and particularly in motorsport now. But presentationally, that was very important probably to Hitler, but very important to Auto Union and Mercedes, was it not?
Oh, yeah, and the Nazis. The Nazis were great at presentation. Everything was black, white, and red, and very simple and bold and rather intimidating, of course, if you weren't part of it. And
Gothic typefaces.
Yep, and intended to be intimidating.
Yes.
Think of the Nuremberg rallies and Hitler's speeches and all the banners, and then Leni Riefenstahl's films of what went on, and the Olympics in Berlin in 1936, of course. And it was all about presentation. And it wasn't, in a way, it was to scare the outside world. If we could make cars that go like this, what do you think? What else do you think we can do? It was to impress the German population as well. I think it was to make, after a difficult time following the defeat in the First World War and then the financial crash, it was to make them feel, something good is happening here. We've got pretty full employment, albeit with some slave labourers here and there. And, we've got money in our pockets, and we've got these signs that we are leading the world in various fields of modern human endeavour.
Do you think we could draw a parallel, or is this a stretch, between Nuvolari's success at Nurburgring in 1935 and Jesse Owens' success in Berlin in 1936?
Oh, very much so, yes. That's a very good parallel. The 1936 Berlin Olympics was supposed to be the showpiece of Aryan supremacy on every level. And then along comes Jesse Owens, the American sprinter who was black and who, of course, wipes the floor with everyone. And, becomes the sort of hero of the hour, which, definitely puts the Nazi high command's noses out of joint. Nuvolari was a bit like that, although, of course, Nuvolari represented another of what became the Axis powers. And he wasn't black, unlike Owens. So that was a setback. But on the other hand, the Berlin Olympics did do basically the job it was supposed to do. I mean, they built this amazing stadium in Berlin, one of the sort of Albert Speer showpieces. If it had carried on, if they hadn't got beaten in the Second World War, the whole of Berlin would have looked like that. It was going to become a kind of like Rome, like Imperial Rome, just this kind of showpiece for this extraordinary architecture. So that was important. Max Schmeling, a German boxer, knocking out Joe Louis, who was a black heavyweight champion of the world in Madison Square Garden in 1936. That was another big success for the Nazi sports program. Joe Louis got his own back a couple of years later in the rematch and finished off Schmeling and got his title back. But those things were really important, really significant.
I mean, we didn't use, or they didn't use, the word marketing back then, but it was marketing, wasn't it, really?
Yes, it was marketing, not just a regime and a government, but a philosophy, for sure. We are better than you in every way.
It wasn't sports washing. I mean, we sometimes say that racing and other sports taking place in places like Saudi Arabia nowadays is sports washing. I don't think it was that, because they didn't think there was anything to wash, was there, at that point?
That may be true. I think there's a little bit of sports washing involved, but we are, Germany Germany didn't have a great reputation internationally after the First World War, so they were trying to, they were burnishing that reputation again, reburnishing it, and trying to create Germany as a force to be reckoned with. And of course, in 1935 or 35, I think, they overthrew all the disarmament provisions of the Treaty of Versailles and revealed that they had acquired an air force, the Luftwaffe, and an army, the Wehrmacht, all along. And actually, the first Messerschmitt Me-109 was unveiled at an air show. And the very first one had a Rolls-Royce engine, funnily enough.
Wow.
But then when it reappeared in production form a little while later, I think the following year, suddenly it had a Daimler-Benz V12 engine of 33 litres, which was had been designed at the Mercedes factory and was
Just 33 litres.
Just 33 litres, yeah. Nothing special.
So it was all about, there was a bit of sports washing, not that we called it that then. There was a bit of marketing, not that we called it that then. And it was about the might of the Third Reich.
It was about the image.
Yes.
The image. They were creating an image. And, he used Leni Riefenstahl. Hitler used Leni Riefenstahl, his favourite filmmaker, to make films about the Olympics and about his Nuremberg rallies, Triumph of the Will, those films, and that was all part of it. That was image building.
So I think since you are a biographer of Richard Seaman, I would just like to ask you again, we touched on it very briefly earlier, but, you only have to Google images of Richard Seaman in his Mercedes, and you will see it decked out in swastikas. Might be hard to look at now, but it's a fact. As I say, or him giving the Nazi salute, which he did on the podium in Nurburgring in 1938. It makes you queasy, or it makes me queasy sometimes to look at it. And, of course, his mother, didn't approve. Did she? Why did he do it? And was he conflicted? Or tell us a little bit about that.
He was conflicted in a sense, in the moral sense, not in the sporting sense. You were offered a seat by Mercedes in 1937, and he got it through taking part in a sort of talent spotting exercise at Monza, where Mercedes took a car down, and 5 drivers, I think, the rest of them were German, or one was Swiss, and the others were German, and Seaman was easily the fastest. So they offered him a contract. He'd had 2 very good seasons in voiturettes, the sort of Formula 2 of its time. So he was obviously very talented, and he proved at this test at Monza that he was the best of the available talent. And they wanted a 4th driver. So they offered him a contract. His parents had been vehemently anti-German. His father died in the middle of all this, but his mother continued that belief that basically Germany was a bad thing.
And she wasn't happy when he took a German wife.
No, and he had misgivings about taking the contract from Mercedes, and he actually had a correspondence with Earl Howe, who was the kind of senior figure in British motor racing at the time. Who'd been an MP, who knew all the cabinet ministers, knew all the heads of the armed forces, and said, "What should I do? I've been offered a contract by this team. Could you take soundings, ask people what they think?" And the sounding came back that it was such a big thing to be offered a contract by the absolute number 1 team of the time that it conferred a kind of honour on Britain, that a British driver should be invited. And it was an opportunity not to be missed. So he signed up. And, on very good terms. He got a good salary. He'd also got a trust fund from his dad who'd died, who was
handy,
quite a rich man. Yep. And his mother had actually bankrolled his early years of racing to, I think she probably spent the equivalent of what would now be £3 million on his, work in the junior formula, which is only what people do nowadays through karting and
True.
F3 and so on. But anyway, he got himself a very nice villa on the Starnberger See, 30 miles from the Mercedes factory. And then he got himself a German wife. He met this 18-year-old. He was, 24 at the time. He met this 18-year-old girl called Erika Popp, whose dad was the chairman of BMW and the founder of BMW, actually. And they wanted to get married, and his mother was vehemently opposed to the idea of him marrying a German girl, absolutely opposed. So she came and met Erika and discovered that she was indeed as charming as she was beautiful. And in other circumstances, had she been an English girl, she would have been perfect. But she couldn't stand for it, and eventually their relationship, Dick and his mother, their relationship fractured, and was still fractured when he died, sadly.
Very sadly. And But when he did die, and that was obviously at Spa in 1939, I believe Hitler sent a huge wreath to the funeral, and again, his mother didn't want anything to do with that.
No. In fact, Mercedes sent representatives, of course. Neubauer and Caracciolo and von Brauchitsch were there. And the German embassy was there. And Hitler sent a giant wreath. I mean, it's about 7 feet tall, of white lilies, which was taken to the church in Knightsbridge, where the funeral was held, but then mysteriously disappeared. It was not taken to the grave in Putney Vale Cemetery. It's believed that it was actually given to the Mercedes representatives in London to dispose of quietly.
We may never know.
We will never know now.
But so it's interesting to talk about Richard Seaman, and obviously we talked about some of the other drivers, and we will do over the next little while. But the cars were extraordinary. I mean, the Auto Union Type A, the P-Wagen, designed by Dr. Ferdinand Porsche again.
P for Porsche.
Yeah, yep. Exactly. And again, Porsche designed it, mid-mounted, well, rear-engined, mid-mounted, you could call it. Supercharged V16, very powerful. Must have been a nightmare to drive, particularly in the wet. Took the likes of Nuvolari to master it. Yeah,
it's very interesting. The first guy who really mastered it in Grand Prix racing was Bernd Rosemeyer, who came directly from motorcycle racing. And, of course, Nuvolari, who, when Rosemeyer had been killed, took over as Auto Union's number one driver, had also come up through motorbikes before becoming, the greatest of all four-wheel drivers. So it was said that because it was so unusual to have a mid-engine car and to have that much power, that it took a guy who was used to motorcycles to master it. Whether that was really true or not, goodness knows, but that's the way it worked out anyway, that Rosemeyer came in with no real reputation in car racing, and in 1936, he won the German, Swiss and Italian Grand Prix and became European champion immediately. And there weren't very many Grand Prix in those days that counted towards the European Championship, which was the equivalent of today's World
Probably
Championship.
5 or 6 a year maximum.
Yep, that's right.
Yeah.
And the three won: Germany at the Nurburgring, Switzerland at Bremgarten and Bern, and Italy at Monza. They were three of those.
Yes. Winning at Bremgarten, not for the faint-hearted.
No, a particularly dangerous circuit, or, well, challenging, shall we say.
I think you were right first time.
Well, yeah. They're all dangerous.
Yeah. Well, they certainly were all dangerous.
They're all dangerous. Some are more challenging than others, and Bremgarten really was one of them, especially in the rain, I think. But, the Nurburgring, the Nordschleife, with its 147 corners, that was challenging.
No picnic either.
No picnic.
No picnic either. So, yes, Rosemeyer mastered the Auto Union. Yes, Nuvolari did. I think also, particularly in hill climbs, Hans Stuck did.
Yep.
Hans Stuck did. And I was at Prescott, obviously in England, Prescott in 2016, to see his son, Hans Joachim Stuck, drive the car that Hans Stuck had raced at Prescott, or not raced, but driven up the hill at Prescott 80 years before, in 1936. Again, it's a 500 bhp plus V16 rear-engined, extraordinary car. What a sight and what a sound, I have to say. Anyway, Hans Joachim Stuck, proudly driving his dad's car up the hill. And I actually remember, and I've noted it down, what contemporary reports said at the time in 1936, because it rained. It rained at Prescott. And I'll read it to you. It's very short, but it's interesting. So Hans Stuck, that's the dad, Hans Stuck Sr., had to cope with heavy rain, and it was described as follows. and I quote, "Spectators who braved the rain were rewarded by the most ferocious series of tail wags we have ever witnessed. Stuck's elbows rising in turn high above the car's sides as he corrected skid after skid, and he finished his run with a particularly huge skid as he crossed the line, which must have made the timing officials jump for their lives."
Fabulous.
Why don't you write like that in The Guardian, my friend?
I know. Hans Stuck's wife, the Hans Stuck of the 30s, Hans Joachim's dad, his wife was half Jewish. She was a tennis player. And I think it was Himmler who wanted to get rid of him, to stop him driving cars, because you couldn't have that, you know. Somehow he was prevailed on to desist and allow Hans Stuck to continue racing.
Well, he did race in Grand Prix as well.
Oh, he did, yeah.
But I think he was most famous as the King of the Hills, wasn't he?
He was, yes, European champion. But then Mercedes came back in 1937, and, you know, they'd got their three big German drivers. And it was interesting to see that Hermann Lang started winning. He won in Tripoli and won at Aarhus. And Caracciola won at the Nurburgring and at Bremgarten again. And the Von Brauchitsch won at Monaco. The race at Aarhus in 1937 was a very special one. It wasn't actually one of the races that counted for the European Championship. But because Aarhus was such an extraordinary circuit, you know, it was a dual carriageway. You raced up one and back down the other. There was a hairpin at one end, a flat hairpin, and at the other end, by this time, there was a 43-degree banking, you know, which you couldn't stand up
with
on.
With no catch fencing or anything.
No
at the
fencing,
top.
no lip or anything at the top to stop you going over. And the two straights were 6 miles each. 6 miles. One way and 6 miles coming back. So you got up to some speed. Anyway, they created, both teams, the German teams, created streamlined cars for this particular race in 1937. And they were probably the most extraordinary Grand Prix cars ever built. I mean, they were, you have to say, you know, whether or not they got swastikas on the tail fairings, they were incredibly beautiful cars. And, of course, you know, the perfect representation of the Nazi ideology. You know, these amazing silver machines completely destroying everything else. We've talked about the Auto Union, the astonishing technical innovations, but we haven't really talked about the Mercedes W25, which was the car they launched in 1934-35, which had a straight-eight supercharged engine, front-engined in the conventional way, unlike the Auto Union, but still a very impressive and intimidating piece of kit. And it was a car that was very difficult to control. The first one, the W25, and it was often said when Seaman did his test for Mercedes, he spun on his first run and came back in and said, and Neubauer said, "Don't worry, everybody, even Caracciola, spun the first time they drove this car." But then a couple of years later, it evolved into the W125. Same idea, same layout, but much better suspension, much lower centre of gravity, and more formidable. And that's when Mercedes really started winning.
Actually, that reminds me of a story, the Merc 125, a W125, because in the late 90s, Mercedes laid on one to be demonstrated at the old Hockenheim, the one with the long straights through the forest, for David Coulthard, McLaren Mercedes driver, to demonstrate. And he did demonstrate it, frightened the life out of him. The next day, Emerson Fittipaldi, who just had his enormous shunt at Michigan, where he hit the wall at 235 miles an hour, and was limping and was already a certain age, got in the car, put a cloth leather helmet on to be authentic, one big puff of a big cigar, got in there and drove it at 170 miles an hour.
Fantastic.
The real stuff, the real deal, eh?
Yep.
Anyway, that's a good time to take a break, Richard. And when we come back, I'd love you to tell us the story of Bernd Rosemeyer's actually finally tragic record-breaking attempts. So welcome back. And before the break, I think I teased a little bit of a teaser saying, Richard, would you tell us the story about Bernd Rosemeyer and the extraordinary streamliner that finally, of course, was a tragic story with his speed attempts?
Yes, well, by 1937, Rosemeyer had become, he'd really overshadowed Caracciola a bit as the German motor racing hero. And even more so when he met a woman called Ellie Beinhorn, who was an aviator, or an aviatrix, as they were known in those days. She was the sort of German Amelia Earhart. She'd made lots of long-distance flights, solo flights, to Australia, for instance. And at one point she did the classic thing of forced landing in the Sahara and was, rescued by Tuaregs after, 5 days alone in the desert kind of thing. So, she was young, beautiful, very courageous, clearly adventurous. And they met on the podium, I think, of the Czech Grand Prix at Brno. And immediately established a relationship, fell in love, I think you would say, and got married. And I think Seaman describes at one point sitting in, I think it was in Berlin, in the week of one of the Grand Prix at Aarhus, and seeing a Messerschmitt Typhoon, which was a four-seater Messerschmitt go ahead, and knowing that was Ellie Beinhorn and Bernd Rosemeyer going to the racetrack.
Wow.
Anyway, they became the sort of golden Aryan couple as far as the National Socialists were concerned. Mercedes and Auto Union started taking record breaking very seriously. And there was a sort of Reich Speed Week on the Frankfurt to Darmstadt Autobahn, which I think was the first one that was completed. Anyway, they'd close off a section of it so they could race up and down, do their timed kilometre runs, and break records, which they both did. And the two teams were vying for supremacy at this endeavour. So one day in 1937, the two teams were both there to compete against each other, really, setting new records. And they both had streamlined cars, very, very spectacular. Caracciola had a Mercedes with a beautiful slippery body, and Rosemeyer had an Auto Union, which in a way was the first ground effects car, because the designer was trying to get air to flow under the car in such a way as to suck it down and increase the traction. And Caracciola went out and set a couple of records at about 268 miles an hour, I think, average speed. For
amazing.
The measured kilometre or whatever it was. Amazing.
It was 268 miles, 432 kilometres per hour. Amazing.
And Caracciola had noticed that it was a windy day. There was a bit of a crosswind. And on this measured kilometre, there were trees on either side. It was kind of wooded Autobahn, but there were gaps in the trees. And the trees weren't in leaf either, so the wind was whistling through a bit. And he had noticed that at one gap in particular, the crosswind was throwing the car a bit off track. And he came back and said, I'm not going to go out again. But Rosemeyer, wanting to beat Caracciola's time, went out in the Auto Union. And sure enough, when he got to the gap in the trees at 260 miles an hour plus, it really sent the car sideways and lost control, went off the track, hit a tree, was thrown out and killed. Although actually I think there wasn't a mark on his body, strangely enough, but he was killed. And a great shock to Germany to lose this hero. So there had to be a kind of state funeral. Joseph Goebbels, I think, wanted an SS funeral because, like the German drivers, he'd been given a rank in the SS. I think he was a Sturmführer. Ellie Beinhorn, not being a convinced Nazi, as indeed Rosemeyer might not have been, didn't want an SS funeral, but was overruled. And sure enough, the full thing was got out. Hitler sent Ellie Beinhorn and the widow a message, a letter which read, "May your grief be lessened by the knowledge that your husband died fighting for Germany." And if there was any doubt about the German government's attitude to motorsport and its uses in image building, Hitler laid it to rest with that sentence, I think. He died fighting for Germany.
My word, he certainly did lay it to rest there. Mm-hmm. I think that fascinating character, obviously, Rosemeyer, and a tragic end. And another driver we've talked about, but en passant, really, rather than in any focus, is Manfred von Brauchitsch. Mm-hmm. Now, oddly, since I wasn't around in the 1930s, and neither, my friend, were you, but oddly, I did meet Manfred von Brauchitsch in the most extraordinary place. I met him, he was 91 at the time, I met him in Alexandra Palace in North London, at the launch of the 1997 McLaren Mercedes Formula One car. I was a journalist at the time. I hadn't started work at McLaren. That wasn't for another 11 years in 2008. But I just can't tell you how confused this 91-year-old man was, standing with military bearing, watching the Spice Girls and Jamiroquai perform while Mika Hakkinen and David Coulthard kind of danced about with them. I just don't think it was what he was expecting at all. I mean, he had a strange life, of course. He'd raced for Mercedes in the 30s. And as you touched on, his father, Walter von Brauchitsch, was a general, then a field marshal, very, very, very senior in World War II, and was arrested on charges of war crimes after the cessation of hostilities then. And by the way, was interned briefly in a prisoner of war camp in Wales, but then managed to return to Germany and died of natural causes, we believe, before he was ever tried, which he was going to be. Anyway, so that was Manfred's dad, Manfred von Brauchitsch. After the war, Manfred had to flee. He fled to South America, didn't like it there, returned to West Germany, of course, as it was then, was arrested for espionage, and went to prison in the early 50s. And then I don't know why I'm laughing, because it's very sad, but then his wife, Gisela, I think you might pronounce it, committed suicide, and he moved to East Germany in the 50s. So, I mean, Manfred von Brauchitsch, the man who famously said after a race, champagne for Caracciola and me and a beer for Lang.
Because Lang was the ex-mechanic.
Yes. So he wasn't worthy of champagne. He had to have beer. But a rather tragic life. I think he was a Sturmführer as well.
Well, he came from a Prussian military family, as you said, and he was expected to go into the army, but I think he fell off his horse at one point, banged his head, and wasn't considered suitable for military service, but fine to drive a 500 horsepower Grand Prix car, yes. Which he did. But when he went to, eventually he went to live in East Germany,
yes.
Having been in jail in the West. And he was in charge of the movement to uphold the Olympic ideal, which, of course, was an ideal that East Germany did everything in its power to uphold.
Absolutely.
With its fantastic state-sponsored doping program.
Yes. Lots of medals, Olympic not athletes. A lot of honour.
Not a lot, no. But that's fantastic that you met him in those circumstances with the Spice Girls. That's a wonderful story.
Extraordinary. He was genuinely nonplussed by the whole thing, I can tell you.
Delighted to hear it.
not a bad driver, not a brilliant driver.
No, he was a bit wild. I mean, you talked earlier about a race in which he destroyed his tyres. I think he did quite a lot of that. In 1938, he was leading the German Grand Prix at the Nurburgring with Dick Seaman in second place. And Seaman was kind of holding station. He knew that a German was supposed to win this home race. But Braukic had really done his tyres in, and he came in for a pit stop to change them. And Seaman came in behind to change his too as a precaution. And von Braukic's car caught fire while it was being refuelled. And Seaman didn't quite know what to do. Am I supposed to go out? Well, they're putting the fire out in Braukic's car. And Alfred Neubauer, the team manager, waved him out, so he went out and won the race. And Braukic, they put the fire out, and he managed to get back in. But then he went off and crashed, and so that's where Seaman got his great victory in the 1938 German Grand Prix, and indeed had to stand on the podium next to von Braukic, and while the German national anthem was played, make a very, very half-hearted Hitler salute. In fact, he looks more like a man trying to flag a bus down outside the Ritz,
yes,
somebody saluting Adolf Hitler.
So, great drivers at the time, though, and we've mentioned, obviously, Nuvolari, we've mentioned Rosemeyer, we've mentioned Caracciola, also one of the greats, brilliant in the wet, absolutely brilliant in the wet. We haven't mentioned Varzi, but he was a great driver at the time, of course. But a driver I wanted to ask you about, who perhaps isn't as well remembered now, a French-Jewish driver, Rene Dreyfus. Tell us a little bit about him and his part in this story.
Yeah, well, Dreyfus was obviously a great driver. Before the Mercedes appeared, he'd been winning races. He was more of a contemporary of Nuvolari and Varzi. And I think he'd been considered for the German teams, but he was Jewish, so he was out of consideration all of a sudden for that. But he got a little bit of revenge in 1938 at the Grand Prix in Pau in southern France, around the houses, a bit like the Monaco Grand Prix. Early in the season, Mercedes had just launched their W154, which was their new machine for 1938. It was unlike the previous car, which had been a straight 8, it was a V12, and it was built to this new 3-litre supercharged formula. You could either have a 4.5-litre unsupercharged or a 3-litre supercharged. And Mercedes and Auto Union both went for the 3-litre option. So the W154, Mercedes decided to take it down to Pau, where Auto Union weren't going, just to give it a run out with Caracciola and Lang, and thinking they wouldn't get much opposition. But then through a series of mechanical misfortunes, mostly, they didn't win the race. And Rene Dreyfus, in a rather outdated French-built Delahaye, managed to win on home soil, which was headlines, French car beats, the German giants. In fact, it didn't mean that much. Delahaye were never going to win anything else that season against the German teams. But it was certainly a nice thing for Dreyfus, who went on, he went to New York, to live in New York, and became a restaurateur.
He did.
With a very successful restaurant, I think, there.
And for many years afterwards.
Yes, and I think motoring journalists who went to New York would often go and visit him and eat there.
Maurice Hamilton has told me that he's done just that.
I'm sure he did. Yep.
I never ate there, did you?
I did not, no. The other driver we haven't mentioned is Hermann Lang. Really, we haven't.
We've touched on him only.
We've touched on him and his background as a mechanic. He joined the Mercedes organisation as the sort of the lowest of the low, but he became a test driver, and it became obvious he was a local man, working class. Became obvious how much talent he'd got, and he found his way into the Grand Prix team. And by 1938, he was the He was the boy. He was of the four drivers they had by that time. He was really the quickest and winning the races, and he became European champion. And they all, very interestingly, they all survived the war. All the significant figures in that team, the drivers, Caracciolo, von Brauchitsch, Lang, and the manager, Neubauer, and the chief engineer, Uhlenhaut, they all managed one way or another to survive. Caracciolo by going to live in Switzerland, not a bad idea, where he drew a Mercedes salary until 1942, when I think Goebbels put a stop to it. And Lang emerged after the war still driving. And in fact, in 1952, when Mercedes went to Le Mans with two new coupes, which was their first really significant re-entry into motorsport, he won the 24 Hours of Le Mans with a co-driver, which was a pretty big thing for Mercedes. Absolutely.
Of course, Mercedes and Le Mans is a separate podcast.
It certainly is.
We've touched on Tazio. Should we say something about him? Extraordinary figure.
Yes.
Drug addict.
Yes. Eventually, yes.
Eventually.
He was. Yeah. He was Nuvolari's great rival.
Absolutely.
In Alphas and Bugattis before the Mercedes and the Auto Unions came along. They had fantastic battles. And he was sort of, his image was the negative of Nuvolari. Nuvolari was all kind of passion and grand gestures and, very thrilling and dramatic to watch. Tazio was a kind of colder figure. His driving wasn't much less dramatic, but that was his image. And then he fell in with a woman who became known as the White Lady, and got seriously into morphine, I think it was.
I think morphine and opium,
and
perhaps.
Opium,
yeah.
Which in the end didn't do his driving or his career very, very much.
Who knew? I was going to say, know something Sherlock, but there you go. So listen, we've talked about some of these extraordinary characters, brilliant drivers, amazing cars, the way it was politicized and Nazified by Adolf Hitler throughout that period. Summing up, Richard, how do you look back on that period of motor racing history? I mean, no one can deny the extraordinary machines, the exceptional races we've described. And by the way, we could have talked for hours and described many more. But the backdrop against which they occurred casts a long shadow, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. The last time those two teams, Mercedes and Auto Union, were seen was on September the 3rd, 1939, 2 days after Hitler invaded Poland, and the very day that Neville Chamberlain declared that Britain was at war with Germany. 2 hours after that announcement, in Belgrade...
I thought it was Belgrade.
It was Belgrade.
Yes.
A 5-car grid competed in what was actually a pretty short race.
It wasn't a Grande Preuve, was it?
It wasn't. It was a Grand Prix, but not a Grande Preuve, which were the races that counted towards the championship. But it was a race, and Mercedes sent 2 cars for Lang and von Brauchitsch. I think Caracciolo had gone off to Switzerland by that point. And Auto Union sent 2 cars for Nuvolari and Hermann Müller. And there was a very old Bugatti driven by a local bloke making up the 5-car grid. And it was not uneventful. There were 50,000 spectators. And Nuvolari won. In fact, I think Lang had been the favourite to win, and he'd been trying to overtake von Brauchitsch. They were first and second, and von Brauchitsch was doing what he usually did, which was going over the verges, and he threw up a pebble that smashed Lang's goggles, and poor chap got back to the pits. And the German teams always travelled with their own doctor. They shared a doctor between them, and he spent the rest of the race picking glass fragments out of Lang's eyes. Anyway, Nuvolari won the race in the Auto Union. Von Brauchitsch was second and Müller was third. Don't know what happened to the Bugatti. But of course, war had been declared, so they had to hightail it back to Germany, and the petrol situation was pretty critical. And they were worried that if they went the shortcut via Hungary in their convoy of trucks, they wouldn't be able to get any fuel. So they went via Slovenia, Croatia, and Austria, and they went in a convoy, the two teams in convoy trucks. And they had to keep a kilometre apart because it was hot, and there was so much dust that if they'd been closer together, they wouldn't have been able to see. And then when the Mercedes team got back to Untertürkheim, their headquarters in Stuttgart, they found the whole thing had been closed up and everything was impounded by the army for the duration. And, the war had started. So that was a pretty strange end to the story of the Silver Arrows. But there was one thing left hanging over. Their record breaking had been very successful, but they had the ambition to take the world land speed record, which had been fought over during the 30s by three Englishmen, Malcolm Campbell, George Easton, and John Cobb. And Cobb held the record at that point at 360-odd miles an hour, I think.
In the Railton Special?
Yeah. Bonneville, I think, Bonneville Salt Flats. And Mercedes, we've got to take this one too. So they'd commissioned Ferdinand Porsche to build them a car which was called the T80, which took a Messerschmitt ME-109 engine, bored it out to 44 litres, put it in this. It was a six-wheel car, four rear wheels driven, and they never finished it, or they didn't finish it at that time. But there was a sort of half-built version of it, and the plans. And eventually, sometime long after the war, Mercedes, as they're very proud of the history of their sporting endeavours, they completed the car. So I think it's now in the Mercedes Museum. Nobody's ever tried to break a record in it, but that was just an extraordinary machine. So that was really their last effort, and the thing that was left hanging over when the curtain came down.
And that feels like a good time to say, and colossally, that's history. Some serious and important, actually, topics in this episode, I think, which we enjoyed digging into, and we hoped you enjoyed listening to it too.
We'll be back with another episode next week. But, as I always say, if you're enjoying the show, please do follow or subscribe to the feed so you never miss an episode. And if you want to leave us a nice review on your podcast app of choice, we'd be enormously grateful, as it really helps other listeners find the show.
Indeed it does. And yes, we love hearing your feedback, and we read it all. So if you want to get in touch with us, you can, and please do drop us a line on podcasts@the-race.com, or you can drop Richard or me a message on X, Twitter, the platform formerly known as Twitter. I'm at the BishF1, and Richard is at rwilliams1947. Until next time, goodbye.
And colossally, that's history.
The Athletic.